Happy Friday, everyone. You'll see a couple unfamiliar faces probably here today. Those of you who don't know, I am Rebecca Weissman. I am part of the Senior Living Foresight team. Steve is not with us today. He is actually on an airplane at the moment. So I have the pleasure of introducing our guests this morning, which I will do in just a minute. But let's kick it off with our little intro that we have here. Give me just a second.
Hey guys, Steve Moran here.
Oh, I always love that. That's so much fun. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to our host for the day, who really needs no introduction, and that is Bob Kramer, and let him introduce you to his guest today. So take it away, Bob.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Kramer, founder and fellow at Nexus Insights, a think tank advancing the well being of older adults through innovative models of housing, community, and healthcare. And I am delighted to welcome today Dr. Sara Geber. Sara is many things, but first and foremost, she is the expert on solo aging. She coined the term, wrote the book, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers. She's also a Forbes.com contributor. And as I said, she coined the term, and she's a foremost thought leader in solo aging. And she's really passionate, as I think you'll hear today, about creating change in senior housing. And more than anything, Sara wants to uh, pull baby boomers out of their denial of aging and point them to positive planning and the good outcomes that can come from good planning. So, Sara, welcome. So glad you
Thank
could
you.
join us.
Thank you, Bob. I'm really happy to be here. And Bob left off one critical thing. I am also a fellow at Nexus Insights and
Indeed.
proud to be one.
And delighted. We have a wonderful group, and I encourage folks go check out nexusinsights.net and meet all of our fellows there. Well, Sara, we titled this show "The Solo Agers Are Coming. Will you be ready for them?" And so I'd like to start out with your just sharing with our viewers what do we mean by solo agers, and kind of how did you come up with this term and so forth. So tell us some about that.
Well, I came up with the term in somewhere around 2013 because I was noticing that so many of my friends and colleagues were spending a tremendous amount of time taking care of their aging parents. And my husband and I had kind of dodged that bullet because our parents had died when we were much younger. But it was interesting to me that I would invite somebody to go to lunch and they say, "No, I've got to go take care of my mother. She needs groceries or she needs prescriptions or whatever." And I thought to myself, I don't have children. Who's going to do that for us? And
Mm.
then I discovered that there are actually quite a lot of people out there who don't have children, especially in the baby boom generation. And not only that, there are people whose children are estranged, whose children live far away. There's really quite a lot of different categories of baby boomers. And Rebecca, if you would show that first screen for me, you'll see all the different categories that baby boomers fall into well beyond childless. And I'm sure that every single one of you listening to this has someone in your family or someone that you know who you would classify as a solo ager. So that's kind of the whole family of solo agers.
So it's
Thanks,
a much
Rebecca.
broader group, in other words, what you're saying, because I think some of us might be inclined to just think, oh, you mean folks that don't have children. But solo agers, that's only one part of the group. It's a much larger group for all the reasons you're showing us here on the visual.
Yes, much larger group, much larger group. And the more I talked about solo aging, again, beginning in about 2013 or so, the more people came up to me and said, "Well, I have a child, but he lives in Denmark, and I'm all alone. I'm by myself. have been divorced for 20 years, or my husband died 10 years ago, and I'm certainly a solo ager too. So I realized at that point that it went well beyond childlessness. There's so many reasons today why people are solo agers and should classify themselves as solo agers.
Well, do we have any data? We sort of talk about this as a significant phenomenon that people ought to be aware of, both as older adults themselves, but also as those such as senior living providers and other aging service providers. So how large is this group? Is it growing in size? Do you have any information you can share with us on that?
I do. And Rebecca, if you would move that to the second slide. Now, this slide is just going to show you childlessness, because the US Census Bureau actually did a study over the last couple of years, and they just released this study in September of last year, demonstrating how the growth of childlessness among older adults is actually pretty startling. So if you see over on the far right, people in the generation before baby boomers, call them the silent generation, or the World War II generation, they only had about 2.2 million who were childless. That's approximately 10% of that population. Now, if you move into the boomers, the early boomers show a huge jump, double that in terms of sheer numbers. And then when you get to the late boomers, it's even more. So the trend of childlessness is actually growing. But the reason that it is so critical now is that the baby boomers need to start preparing for their older life. And a lot of them are just sort of blissfully unaware that different times are coming as they get older. There will be challenges that they're not anticipating. And especially there will be an unanticipated challenges for solo agers, because in a very real sense, they don't have a safety net. I kind of look at children as a safety net. And I get all kinds of pushback about that, because people say, "Oh, I don't want to depend on my adult children." But when push comes to shove, I've seen this so many times. The kids rush in from wherever they are to kind of help wherever they can, get mom or dad settled in a better place for them to live, get them moved into a senior living environment. So many different things that adult children help with, and people who are solo agers and or childless really aren't going to have that help.
Mm. So planning becomes all the more important then if you're a solo ager, is what you're saying, among other things.
Yes, it certainly becomes more urgent. I think
Mhm.
it's important for everyone to plan. Um, I'm just one of these people that's kind of a natural planner, but very obviously many people aren't. However, solo agers, whether they've been procrastinators all their lives or just in timers, they
Mhm.
need to really think hard about what's going to be out there for them and how they're going to keep themselves safe as they get older.
Well, this chart definitely sort of graphically what you're saying is that really the numbers are almost doubling with each successive cohort, and we're going from slightly over 10% as childless to nearly 20% childless with the second half of the boomer cohort. So that's
Correct.
that has significant implications as we think about senior living, as we think about aging services more broadly. To a great extent, this one could say the senior living sector really took off in the 90s, and it took off because not only were the greatest generation members having all these surprise extra years, but when they needed care, the adult child, more often than not the adult daughter, was now in the workforce. And
Right.
so hence assisted living and independent living and options like that suddenly just exploded in this country. But let's talk some about what are some of the how do those that are providing services or planning for the future to provide services to older adults, how do they need to think about the needs of solo agers? In other words, before they were a tiny group, now you're saying, looking forward in the future, they're going to be 1 out of 5, and that's just childless. That doesn't count folks that are solo agers for all the other reasons. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a major news story that got a lot of play around just how many folks are estranged from their adult children. And that would obviously could feed into these numbers that you're talking about. So share with us a little bit about what are the particular needs of solo agers that we may have also sort of ignored before as we think about serving older adults.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I love to get, because there are so many things that adult children typically do for their aging parents. And that's the key way that I have looked at what senior living providers need to think about in the future. And Rebecca, if you would show that third slide now, that's going to give you an idea of what adult children typically do for their aging parents. And my observation is they do some of these things regardless of whether their parents are aging in their home or aging in a senior living community somewhere. They still fulfill all of these things. I have a cousin who lives in town, and her mother is 98, and she is now living in a kind of a board and care home. But Sharon, my cousin, still goes over there and buys her new nightgowns when she needs them, intervenes with the staff when the inevitable "I don't like the food" comes up, and pays all her bills, manages all of her stock portfolio. And this woman at 98 has all her faculties. Physically, she has declined quite a bit, but she is sharp as a tack. She'll call me to say hello, and she doesn't even have to look up my phone number. It's in her memory. It's better than I can do. So if you look at this chart, these are the kinds of things that solo agers are not going to have anyone to do for them. And unless they are very proactive and engage a trust department of a bank or a fiduciary or some kind of legal guardian for themselves, and I don't even like to use that term really, because we don't like it to come to that, but they need to think ahead as to who's going to do that for them. Now, most solo agers do have a niece, a nephew, a younger cousin somewhere that they could engage to help them with some of this. They can put them on their advance directive. They can make them powers of attorney. But once some of these solo agers start living in these communities that you run and manage, they're going to need some of these things provided for them somewhere within the community. So I give you something to think about. Will you need to ensure that someone is there to help them sort through their insurance, to help them sort through whatever real estate they still have and need to manage, the bills that need to be paid? They may be perfectly capable, if you're a life plan community, and they may be perfectly capable of handling all of these things when they move in. But what happens when they're not? So it's just something to start thinking about with your own communities. How can we help people to continue to meet these obligations without family around to pick up the pieces?
Well, it's interesting what you've pointed out, kind of all the roles that adult children, even very often for their parents when they, as you said, are living in senior living communities, the roles adult children are playing. Because it's often been said that in terms of senior living communities, particularly assisted living, memory care, well, the adult child, you don't have to worry. We're going to oversee mom's support needs and care needs. but you've pointed out a whole host of areas here where, like, what you're saying is, well, yes, when the adult daughter, we may be saying, you don't need to worry about mom falling in the middle of the night or leaving the stove on. But when there's no adult daughter, who's going to be, or son for that matter, who's going to be meeting all these needs? And
Correct.
that is going to be a real challenge. It also obviously creates a business opportunity.
It does.
Yeah.
It absolutely does.
Well, let me pivot for a moment if I can. And I'm acknowledging it as a pivot because here we're kind of talking about needs as you're getting older, either because you may have less mobility or declined cognitive function, or just simply you may have lost the person in your life who dealt with some of these things before, and now that person's not there. But let's switch to looking at it the other way. What are keys to happiness for solo agers? Let's talk about the positive. Let's talk about the lifestyle, and what kind of lifestyle is going to meet the needs that all of us have, but in this case, the needs of solo agers.
Well, I'm a crusader for solo agers living in some kind of community. I think it's terribly important as solo agers get older that they think about who's going to be part of their community, how they're going to maintain their community. And I use community in a very broad sense of the word. Community to me isn't a place; it's a um, it's a it's a group of people in your life. And we're social animals. I believe people need to be with other people, live with other people. There are lots of opportunities for people to live in closer proximity to one another than they are in their 3-story suburban home on a cul-de-sac somewhere where they don't even know many of their neighbors or any of their neighbors. And I have run into that so often where
Mhm.
people say, gosh, I'm glad I moved into this co-housing community because before I only knew one person on my whole block and I lived there for 17 years. And that was startling to me. But there are lots of opportunities for people to join and stay in community. And to me, senior living is the opportunity to do that that really stands out in my mind. But senior living needs to be able to make some promises to some of these solo agers that they're going to be taken care of in all aspects. But what really makes, I want to answer your question, Bob, without going back to what I was previously talking about. What makes solo agers happy is engagement,
Mhm.
being with other people, and also having the opportunity for some alone time. Lots of people are introverts and don't want to spend their entire life eating with others and talking to others and being with others. They want that alone time, but it needs to have some sort of a safety net underneath it that is provided maybe by the community, maybe by adult children or nieces or nephews, some combination of the above. And there are people out there, I've known a number of them now, that really have no family whatsoever.
Yeah.
And they're going to need a safety net too. And they're
Well, I
going to
think
need companionship.
oftentimes many people tend to think, older adults particularly, that it's kind of a binary choice. By that, I mean, I'm either going to stay in my single family home that has all kinds of memories and so forth, or I'm going to be in a nursing home. And they think of those two options. And not surprisingly, they say, I want to stay where I am.
Yeah.
So two things: how should they think differently, and then B, what are you seeing? I know between the column that you write in Forbes.com, your book, I know you do a lot of speaking. What are you seeing as some of the many options so that are just exploding out there for solo agers to think of in terms of community? So let's what do we mean by community even more? What are some examples?
Yes, loads of examples today. We're hearing much more about home sharing. I love the idea of home sharing a la Golden Girls.
Hmm.
Um, uh, that can be golden guys too. people living together for the sake of someone saying, how was your day? And someone will miss you if you don't walk in the door in the evening, and or come back from the store, and someone to care about you. So home sharing has become much more popular. There are a number of websites. The one I always refer to as Silver Nest,
Mhm.
which brings people together for the purpose of home sharing. And there are ways of home sharing with people you already know. You may have a home that with an extra bedroom or two that you would like to rent out, or you may want to go live with someone who has a home that with a bedroom to share. I've become a huge fan of mobile home parks, because mobile home parks give people an opportunity to have their own space and
Mhm.
to also be in very close proximity to other people. Most people that I know that live in some of these lovely mobile home parks around me have a big community room. They get together for potlucks. They see each other every day when they pick up their mail or walk their dogs. They go to movies. They do all kinds of things. And they certainly weren't lonely during the pandemic. And that's one of the other issues that comes up all the time is, what about the pandemic? And what about future pandemics? And I think the best way of guarding yourself against loneliness in this or future pandemics is to live with others. So, yeah, there's co housing, there's home sharing, there's uh, intentional communities of all kinds. You have only really to explore what's out there. And I think you're so right, Bob. So many people saw their grandparents die in an awful nursing home with two or three people in a room, and nobody wants to do that. But there's so much else out there now, so much else in the way of assisted living, in the way of board and care homes, in the way of life plan communities. There's really something for every budget, but you have to look, and you have to really look around the country. Sometimes there are areas where they're much more affordable than others. And
Mhm.
I encourage people all the time to go on tours, find a senior living community near them and just go on a tour.
Mhm.
Start to check them out.
Well, lately, Sarah, there's a phrase that's gained a lot of momentum, a lot of popularity, both with consumers, but also with policymakers, and that's aging in place. And as I sort of made an oblique reference to earlier, but for many, there are continual surveys. AARP probably does the one that gets the most publicity, surveys of older adults, and again, many of these adults are often in their 50s and 60s, not their 80s and 90s. And overwhelming percentages say they want to age in place.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit. In other words, uh, is 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 that a good plan to just say you're going to age in place? And particularly if one is a solo ager or realizes you're at risk of becoming a solo ager. You know,
Well, I
what does
used to
that mean?
I used to say in my talks, I don't say this anymore because I like to, as you were saying, Bob, I like to unpack it a little more. But I used to say in my talks to solo agers that I am the anti-solo age. I am the anti-aging in placer, because most people, again, as you said, they see that as a dichotomy. I either age in place or I go to some terrible um, skilled nursing facility somewhere.
A place
And
I'm
that,
put into and
yeah,
forced
something
into
I'm put
because my
into.
lack of capabilities. Yeah.
Right. So I much prefer the term aging in the right place. And
Hmm.
that takes research. It takes knowing what's out there. It takes talking to people. It takes making plans with the family that you do have. It takes reaching out in every direction that you have to make a good plan for yourself and where you want to age. So for solo agers, think of aging in place as aging in the right place. Find that right place now. Find that right place while you're in your 50s or 60s. Downsize now. get out of that 2 or 3 story suburban home that is not going to serve you well when you're in your 80s. It
Yeah.
just won't. No
One of
matter
our
what the
colleagues, you and I, one of our colleagues at Nexus Insights, Dr. Bill Thomas, likes to say, "You may love that single family home you've been in for years, but your home may not love you."
That's right.
And I think it's a good illustration of just what you're talking about. But as when you talk about planning, you talk about sort of do your homework, research, so forth. But in one sense, everyone's different. Doesn't that research start with doing your own assessment of yourself? Meaning, what's most important to you? What are things that bring you satisfaction, happiness, joy? Because in a sense, that's then what you're going to say, well, how can I continue to have that 10 or 20 years from now? So maybe just comment a little bit on that.
Sure. That's why I don't want to tout my book, it's out there, but it's one of the reasons why a lot of the interior of my book is a lot of worksheets. It's a lot
Mhm.
of values clarification stuff and quizzing yourself on where you'd rather be at certain times, who you'd rather be with. And that's terribly important to do. If you think back to when you were just out of college, you may have taken some assessments that to help you find just the right profession for you. In the same way, finding the right place to live for everyone is an important step to take. And that's if you're a solo ager, whether you're married or childless or divorced or widowed or never been married. There's all kinds of situations out there. And knowing ourselves is so, so important. So I'm glad you brought that up, Bob, because it's just a critical piece of figuring out what's the right next move for everybody.
Well, just uh, in terms of looking at the discussion in your book and what you've just also said right now, one of the things that strikes me is if you don't do this type of assessment that you give worksheets for and tons of questions for and so forth, what happens is you end up trying to shoehorn the person you are into a setting versus saying, this is what I'm looking for. Now I know the criteria for the places I'm going to investigate. So rather than, well, gee, I'm in a crisis and I guess I've got to accept this, you have a chance to proactively say, what's the kind of life I want to have and what kind of place is going to give that to you? So I think this
Absolutely.
sense of being forced into something that isn't me often is a result that we haven't really thought, well, what do I want? And where I'm living in the future can be key to whether or not that's really available to me, accessible to me. So,
Absolutely. I often hang out with a bunch of people that call themselves retirement coaches. And in fact,
mhm,
I used to be a retirement coach before I got into this. Well, it was kind of a midway thing, but at any rate, I always go to their conferences and I talk to them about being very holistic about the
mhm,
person they're coaching and helping them look forward, not just find what brings them meaning and purpose now and finding a new way to be in quote unquote
mhm,
retirement, but also to think about the future. And they're in a unique position to do that. So I also encourage people to engage in some coaching at this point in their life from retirement coaches that
mhm.
know they've been there and done that with a lot of their clients and they know what's out there. And retirement coaching can also play a big role in senior living.
Mhm. Yeah. What, given some of the things we've talked about, one might think that the time of the COVID-19 pandemic has just been an unmitigated disaster for solo agers. I mean, we know it's taken a particularly tragic toll amongst the oldest among us, uh, and we know many people have experienced social isolation and being shut in, and not just because they're 75 or 95, but those who are 22. But talk a little bit about, you know, what's the resilience been like of solo agers during the time of the pandemic? So what kind of resilience have you seen, or, have for Solo Agers? Has there been you know, has this been a particularly hard time on Solo Agers, or have there been some positive things about what you've seen of how Solo Agers have reacted during COVID?
I think there's been a little of both. I've seen some very positive um, new pieces of the puzzle come into play. There are organizations that have sprung up. Two that come to mind are one called Vitality Society, started by Meredith Oppenheim. There's also Amava. Those are both, they happen to exist on opposite coasts, one in New York and one here where I am in California. But they served people in their homes, and they offered everything from workout classes to art classes to um, kind of virtual travel groups to discussion groups. So a lot of people who were essentially became shut-ins
Hmm.
had tremendous resources that grew out of a need. They grew out of the pandemic need. So a lot of the solo agers that I'm in touch with and that I know took advantage of those things.
Hmm.
And took advantage of the structure, the social structure, the social support system that they had built for themselves as well, and uh, embraced Zoom and other technologies that help them to be engaged with other people on a regular basis, and we all did what we could.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's out there, and I think that because those things are out there, it will continue to be an advantage to solo agers, and should be to. I know that a lot of senior living communities have also
Hmm.
developed programs like that, or have embraced some of the programs that I mentioned.
Well, it's also certainly encouraged and spurred on alternative community arrangement and housing models like Jake Rothstein's model down in Fort
Hmm.
Lauderdale. I'm drawing a
Upside
blank.
home,
Upside Home. Yeah,
upside home.
Upside Home,
Yeah.
again, for our viewers. Again, which is providing both a bit of you talked about a support system or a safety net, and you also talked about engagement and community. But it's not in the traditional age qualified or age restricted way. And so, again, as you do, I see so many of these models sprouting up, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's really needed. And to a certain extent, COVID may have propelled many of us, including solo agers, in that crisis. We maybe were propelled to do some things that otherwise we might have procrastinated on or not
Hmm.
discovered, just as so many folks discover. I mean, I never thought I'd be doing all the Zoom meetings. And 4 years ago, I was clueless about all this technology, and I've had to learn. Well, before we wrap up, the last question I'd like you to address again is, if I'm a senior living operator and I'm saying, wow, those numbers you showed on that slide, that's huge. I'd always thought of that as a tiny sort of subsector of the folks we were serving. And you're saying just amongst the childless, it's going to go to be 1 to 5, and that not counts all the other reasons people are solo. So what does that mean for me as a provider? Two areas. One, how I market and attract these folks. Two, what I'm going to be needing to provide them. Just your closing comments on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, those are the two key areas. What are you going to do to appeal to them? What additional services, based on what you've heard me say today, what additional services could you offer to these people? And it'll be a competitive market. If I have my way, solo agers will be out there looking for opportunities to not be in trouble when they get older. So they'll be looking for senior living communities that offer them what they want. And I could spend a lot of time talking more about that. But I think that I've at least given you a bunch of clues to what it will be, the kind of services that they'll need. So, yeah, start now.
Good. Well, Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. And I encourage all of our viewers to go out and, if you haven't already, get Sarah's book. And Sarah, give me the exact full title again for our listeners.
Sure. It's Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers. And I have to look at what comes after the colon myself. A Retirement and Aging Roadmap for Single and Childless Adults.
Great. And you can also be looking I expect in the next month, Nexus Insights, Sarah, together with another of our fellows, Ryan Frederick, is authoring an op-ed around the issue of aging in place. And so get Sarah's book and look for that op-ed. Thank you, Sarah, for your time and for your passion about this topic, and particularly about these older adults. So appreciate the time. And with that, Rebecca, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you both, Bob and Sarah. What an interesting discussion. As someone, I'm kind of in my late 30s myself, and I know lots of people my age who don't have any kids, and the question becomes like, what happens? So it's a really interesting problem that I think is only going to become more and more front and center as we move forward. And just as a little plug for ourselves, you mentioned Jake Rothstein with Upside Home. We interviewed him. We have a podcast coming out next Wednesday. Our Rachel Hill, who most of you are probably familiar with, interviewed Jake. So keep an eye out for that next week. Again, thank you so much, Bob and Sarah, and we will see you all next week.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.